Before I get started, I want to ask a couple of questions. I'm curious, folks in the room, when you think about road mapping, how many of you roadmap for your product on an annual basis? Once every year or so. And how many of you do it quarterly? Every 3 months? Okay, a few more of you. You can raise your hand for both. How many of you do it somewhere in between there? Maybe more organically, every 6 weeks, every couple of months? Fantastic. Last question. How many of your roadmaps look like this? Does this look familiar? Yeah, maybe? So for the majority of my career, this is how I would roadmap my product. I would typically start out a few weeks before a quarter starts, and I would say, okay, what are the objectives? What is it that I want to accomplish over the next 3 months? Typically, those objectives wouldn't change dramatically. It would be things like acquire new users or retain existing users. I'd then ask the question, what have I learned so far? What have I learned over the last 3 months about my users and my product? And how might I translate that into actionable products, projects, or initiatives? Once I went through that exercise, I'd meet with my design and engineering leads and say, okay, look, here's what I'm trying to accomplish over the next quarter, and here are the projects that I think will lead us to those outcomes. Help me figure out who I need and when I need them. And so we do a rough scoping exercise, and we come out with something that looks a lot like this. It's a table in a PowerPoint slide, or it's a Google Doc, a modified Google spreadsheet, with projects laid out line by line, nice and neatly, color-coded to indicate what resources I'd need and when. And I'd also align each of those projects to a specific timeline. And it felt really good to start the quarter with this. Every time, I feel like I had it nailed. Every single project lined up perfectly, sequenced beautifully. Inevitably, though, within a few days of the quarter starting, it would devolve into chaos. My roadmap would look more like this, maybe 30 days in, not even. So despite my best intentions, for some reason, I could never totally figure out how to represent all of those bug fixes and enhancements that my team was working on nonstop throughout the quarter. They were always there. And there was always, at least once a year, a pet project that would come from my VP or the chief product officer. They had talked to an investor, or they read a study, and they had this great idea, and could I please find a place for it in my roadmap? Sure, okay, can do that. And then, of course, there's the situation where you've done your due diligence with your design and engineering partners, and you felt pretty good at the beginning of the quarter that your project would take about 2 months. And then you kick that project off, and suddenly it's more like 2.5 months, 3 months, maybe even 4 months. So it's chaos. The roadmap is chaos. You start with the best intentions, and it leads to something like this. It feels like a mess. So I started to ask myself, I said, why do I keep doing it this way? It's so painful. I've been doing product for so long. It doesn't have to be like this. The answer is simple, the more I thought about it. A project-based roadmap feels really safe. It's safe because it's something I know how to do. I've created roadmaps like this my entire career. So when I hear it's roadmap planning time, I immediately get out my Google spreadsheet, and I start thinking about what colors I want to use to represent which function. I dive right in. The other reason it's safe is because it looks like I'm in control. When I deliver a product roadmap that looks like that table at the beginning of a quarter, there's no doubt, at least I think, in the eyes of my stakeholders, that I know what I'm doing, that I'm thinking strategically about what I want to accomplish in my product and how, and I'm thinking efficiently about how to use resources. So it feels really safe, feels good. But it actually, in reality, was working against me. And it works against me in 4 different ways. The first is that I found myself managing a lot of boxes all the time. In a project-based roadmap, each of those individual boxes needs to be moved around every time scope changes. And that 2-month project ends up being 3 or 4 months. So what I saw myself doing over and over again was updating that table or updating that spreadsheet because things inevitably were moving around. And I wasn't listening to users. I wasn't looking at my product at all. I was spending most of my time managing the boxes. What I also found is that I was becoming results obsessed. This is not a good thing. With a project-based roadmap, I was obsessed with making sure everything was kept on track. Every single project delivered in the timeline that I had committed to. And so when a project would launch, I'd want to take the time to understand how it was performing, not because I cared about the impact of that project on the business, but because I wanted to know whether I should feel good about prioritizing it or not. Did I make the right decision? It became more of a reflection of me than a reflection of the quality of the work. And when I thought about this project-based roadmap format, the third thing that came to mind was the fact that I was literally boxing my users and my product in. Each of those rectangles represents a start date and an end date. And in between those two bookends are clear assumptions about scope. And so I found myself razor-focused on delivering against that box. So if any kind of competing or challenging insight came in that would tell me to do things a little bit differently, no, I'm razor-focused on this box. It became very hard for me to deviate from that and respond in real time to customer needs and product insights. The fourth limitation of this format, and the one that really hit home for me the more I thought about it, was the fact that it was really at the root of my communication problems as a product leader. As product managers, we really struggle with communication. We really do. I was experiencing over and over again just this constant stream of questions from my stakeholders and executives. Give me the status of this project. Why isn't this one delivering on time? And in the same way that I spent most of my time managing boxes, I spent most of my communication explaining status, talking about what was going on and why, and if things had to move, what the new timeline was and why. So I wasn't having quality conversations with any of my colleagues, with any of my stakeholders, with any of my executives. I was merely communicating status, and that's what they expected of me. So when I started at Betterment almost a year ago, I told myself I didn't want to repeat these patterns. I didn't want to continue to pursue project-based roadmaps. I wanted to end the cycle. I wanted to do things differently. This is a view of my team's quarterly roadmap. What you're looking at here is a roadmap that's based on questions. It's not based on projects. You're seeing a distinct lack of boxes here. There's not any fancy color coding. There's no timelines associated here either. Let me explain what's going on here. So at Betterment, I head up the growth team. So I manage a team of product managers, of growth marketers, and of content strategists. And there's one thing only that we know for sure, that we are so confident about, and that's our charter. My team's charter is to grow Betterment's funded customer base. So that's the number of people who create a Betterment account and deposit at least $1 into that account. Beyond that, we are brutally honest with ourselves. We actually have no idea how to accomplish that. We're humble. And so the great thing about a questions-based roadmap is that we move away from the boxes because the boxes communicate a level of confidence in a particular product or solution that we simply don't have. By focusing more on questions, we also blow away any kind of constraints that might be inherent when you think about a particular product or solution. When we think in terms of questions, all options are on the table. There are lots of different ways that we can try and seek answers to find the best answers. And so we start to think outside of the box. My team gravitates towards more creative and innovative solutions as a result. They're not thinking in terms of, this is the product I have today, so these are the confines of what I have to work in. Everything's on the table. The other great thing with a questions-based roadmap is that it's broken my cycle of being results-obsessed, and I see it in my team, too. So instead of launching products and projects and saying, how did this thing do? Should I feel good or should I feel bad? Instead, we're seeking answers. We're not seeking validation, we're seeking answers. Every single answer we get, no matter how big or how small, effectively operates as a breadcrumb. It allows us to create a vision of the future. It tells us about our users, about our product, and about our business. It's not a look-back metric, it's a look-forward tactic. How do we build one of these? And how can you, most importantly, start building one of these as well? The first thing we do as a team, we do this quarterly, we sit down and we say, what are the opportunity areas? What are the areas of the product that we want to improve over the next 3 months? An opportunity area is not the same thing as a specific product or feature. These are not one-to-one. An opportunity area is meant to represent a milestone in your product, a user experience milestone. For example, one of the opportunity areas my team works on is one that we call activation. And for us, activation is the experience a user has up to and through account creation. That covers a lot of territory, covers a lot of ground. It includes any kind of marketing the user might interact with off product. It includes their landing experience, either in our native mobile app or on our website. It also, of course, includes the flow through sign-up. It's pretty expansive. So taking an opportunity area view automatically starts to unlock more innovation. It frees you from those constraints. The next thing we do is we start listing out projects. And I know that might seem a little bit contradictory because I've been telling you up until this point, don't do projects. But at this point in building a questions-based roadmap, start thinking in terms of projects and solutions. And once you have them all out on the table, figure out what that kernel, that underlying hypothesis under each of them is. That's the root of your question. So for example, we see within our activation opportunity area, a lot of users fall out of our sign-up flow when they hit the email address step. It's also the first step in the funnel, so that's kind of concerning. So my team sat down and we said, what could we do about this? We could move the question. We could add a screen ahead of the question so that people know what to expect. Maybe we change the design of the screen so that it feels more delightful to give an email address to Betterment. When we took a step back and looked at those solutions, what we realized is that the underlying hypothesis was one that was built on trust. Users likely don't trust us enough to signal that initial level of commitment. And so from there, we said, aha, this is a moment for a strategic question. The next piece of advice I give you when it comes to building a questions-based roadmap is to ask the right type of question. I say embrace humility by asking how, not can. What you want to do is you want to frame your questions with as open of a mind as possible. And when you ask strategic questions that are more binary in nature, meaning yes or no, or they can be answered with this versus that, you're constraining your thinking. How is a beautiful way to ask a question, because there's so much nuance and description in answering that. And so you really open yourself up to possibility, to different ways of answering it, to different insights that help grow your overall understanding of your product and your user. Lean towards how, be humble. Finally, make sure everything you have is tied back to a KR. I would be remiss, I'm a product leader. You have to make sure that what you're prioritizing can be aligned to a core business metric. That's what you see in KRs. I want to talk now about storytelling, because this is the communication piece that I think is really critical and really delightful about a questions-based roadmap. Tell your story. What's so great about a questions-based roadmap is that it's rooted in answers. It's all about seeking answers. With answers, you start to write a story. You start to create a narrative about your users and your product that's essentially unfolding in real time. That's powerful. At Betterment, very tactically, what we do is at the end of the month, we'll do a look back on the previous month. We'll take our quarterly strategic questions and we'll talk about what we did over the last month. What did we learn, and how are we going to apply that learning moving forward? And my team literally puts together a document where they are drafting a narrative, an answer to that strategic question with those guidelines and that structure in mind. And that narrative is circulated around the company. Our collaborative teams see it, our execs see it, our general managers see it. Everyone is reading that narrative, and what's amazing is that the quality of communication now, the exchange that we have with those leaders and with our teams is much more valuable. I'm getting fewer questions about what's the status of this project versus that. When is this coming? Why is that delayed? What we're talking about now are real insights about our customers and our business. We're having great conversations about things like intent and developing intent and recommendations and the role of recommendations in financial decision making. God, I would much rather have those conversations than be the status update queen who's trying to represent every single box and the status of each in every single communication. When I think about why storytelling works as a communication medium, it comes down to two truths for me as I've observed my team and the successes here. The first is that stories are memorable. Stories are memorable. As kids, we're often told stories by family and friends and loved ones. It's a communication tactic. It's a way of understanding the world that we learn very young. And so when my team puts together a narrative, puts together a story about our users and our product, we're tapping into that almost primal way of understanding the world. We immediately can make that connection with the audience. The Baby Unicorn, this was one of my favorite books growing up. I haven't read it in probably 30 years, maybe more, but I remember it. I remember the plot, and I promise I didn't look it up on Amazon, I didn't cheat. I remember this plot. It stuck with me. That's what we want to tap into when we're storytelling around our roadmaps. The second core truth about stories is that they elicit an emotional investment. Twin Peaks, the original TV series that aired in the early 90s, was notorious for ending its episodes on cliffhangers. After every episode, you had to tune in next week to figure out how this thing would resolve. And it's that emotional investment that my team is tapping into when we create stories around our question-based roadmaps. We're tapping into that primal way of understanding the world. And we're encouraging emotional investment in the work that we're doing. It's been incredibly powerful. I'll end on this. Not all of you are going to be in a position, or are currently in a position, where you can fundamentally change the way that you roadmap or the way that your roadmaps look. But what you can do, and what I challenge you to do, is to ask more questions of your product and of your users. Ask better questions. Lean towards the how, not the can or the will. Spend more time listening to the story that your users and your product are telling you. Tell that story back to your stakeholders. Tap into the memorability of stories. Tap into the emotional investment that's created from them. It's through a questions-based roadmap that I've come to realize that the root of innovation is not necessarily creative genius, but it's actually in humility. It's embracing that you don't have the answers and being open to finding them. So I want to ask you right now, take this moment, right now in this room. Ask yourself, how will my curiosity shape the future of my product and my users? Thank you.